A family climbed a mountain to escape a war. The actors playing them mostly grew old and passed on, but a few, remarkably, are still close. Here's where the real cast of The Sound of Music actually ended up. The reinventions, the quiet exits, the losses nobody talks about, and where each of them stands right now, in 2026. Julie Andrews. Maria. Few fans realize that the voice most people associate with pure, effortless joy was permanently silenced by a single surgery decades later. Julie Andrews was 29 when she played Maria, and the role barely felt like performance. She brought a kind of open-hearted warmth to the character that made the Alps feel like home. That same year, she'd already won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Mary Poppins, meaning 1964 and 1965 produced back-to-back defining performances of her entire career, released within months of each other. Then, in the late 1990s, a routine surgery on her vocal cords went catastrophically wrong. The operation was meant to remove non-cancerous nodules. Instead, it left permanent scarring that ended her singing career outright. The exact instrument that had carried her through decades of stage and screen work, gone, seemingly overnight. Andrews pursued legal action against the surgeon involved, and the case eventually settled. But no settlement could undo what had actually happened. For a performer whose identity had been built around her voice since childhood, singing in her parents' vaudeville act in England before she was even a teenager, that loss wasn't just professional, it was personal, in a way that took years to process publicly. What happened next surprised almost everyone. Instead of retreating from public life, Andrews rebuilt herself around an entirely different set of skills. She became a prolific children's author, writing story after story with her daughter. She published 2 candid memoirs, Home and Homework, detailing both her early years and the industry that shaped her, unflinching about the surgery and everything that followed it. She moved into voice acting and narration, including a long run in the Shrek franchise that introduced her, entirely on her own terms, to a generation who had no idea she'd once sung on a mountainside in a nun's habit. In 2000, Queen Elizabeth II made her a Dame Commander of the British Empire, formal recognition of a career that had, by then, already reinvented itself once. It's worth remembering just how early her performing life actually started, too. Andrews made her professional stage debut as a child in England, and by the time Hollywood came calling, she'd already carried major stage roles built entirely on live vocal performance, night after night for years. That kind of foundation, proving herself through more than one skill, decades before any camera was ever involved, probably explains why she adapted so completely once her singing voice was taken from her later in life. She'd already spent a lifetime showing audiences she could hold their attention without relying on just one gift. She's 90 now, largely retired from on-screen acting, still occasionally narrating, still writing. Her voice changed. Her legacy never did. Christopher Plummer, Captain Von Trapp. Ironically, the actor who gave audiences one of cinema's most beloved father figures spent years publicly resenting the film that made him famous. Christopher Plummer was 35 when he took the role of Captain Von Trapp, arriving from a serious Shakespearean stage career, Stratford, Broadway, demanding classical roles built over years of training. A family musical, however beloved, felt to him at the time like a professional detour, and he wasn't shy about saying so. For decades afterward, he'd refer to the film dismissively in interviews, occasionally joking about its title in ways that would genuinely surprise anyone who only knows him as the Captain. Behind the scenes, his relationship with the young cast members was famously gruff. Not unkind exactly, but distant, businesslike. A far cry from the tender on-screen thaw his character eventually undergoes. Several of his surviving co-stars have since described it less as coldness and more as dry humor that took years to properly understand. He reportedly wasn't the studio's first choice for the role either, and he had real reservations before signing on, worried it would permanently type him as a musical romantic lead rather than the serious dramatic actor he wanted to be. But something shifted as decades passed. Plummer kept working relentlessly, stage, film, television, refusing to let any single role define his range. He returned again and again to the classical work that had shaped him early on, taking on some of the most demanding roles in the English-language stage canon well into his 70s and 80s, at an age when most actors have long since scaled back. In 2012, at 82 years old, he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for Beginners, becoming the oldest actor ever to win a competitive Oscar at the time. In 2008, he published a widely praised memoir, In Spite of Myself, and in later interviews, closer to the end of his life, he finally spoke about the sound of music, with genuine warmth, acknowledging the role had given him something his stage work never quite managed: a permanent place in the public imagination. There's something almost fitting about that late-life turn. Plummer spent decades trying to prove he was more than one film. By the end, he didn't need to prove it anymore. The body of work spoke for itself, and he could finally afford to be generous about the role that started it all in the public eye. He died in 2021, at 91, after complications from a fall. Eventually, even the film he once resisted became part of the legacy he accepted. Charmian Carr, Liesl von Trapp. Unlike most actors from a film this beloved, Charmian Carr never really tried to stay famous. She was 21 when she played Liesl, the eldest von Trapp daughter, delivering one of the film's most quoted moments, 16 going on 17, with real nerves and real youthful excitement underneath the choreography. And then, fairly quickly, she simply stepped away from acting almost entirely. What she built instead was a genuinely successful second career as an interior designer, taking on high-profile residential projects for years, including homes for other well-known entertainment figures. She became a mother of two, and she spoke often about deliberately choosing a quieter, family-centered life over sustained visibility, at a time when that choice wasn't necessarily celebrated the way it might be today. In 2000, she published a best-selling memoir, Forever Liesl, offering fans a rare, honest look at what it actually felt like to be a young woman at the center of one of the most beloved musicals ever made. Her final years were harder to write about. Carr was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, a form of the disease that receives far less public attention than more commonly discussed types. Her family chose to speak openly about her decline as it progressed, which, without ever intending to, turned Carr into an unexpected face for awareness around a condition most people know almost nothing about, one that often strikes people younger than typical dementia diagnoses, and affects personality and behavior before memory itself. That openness mattered. Public figures rarely discuss cognitive decline while it's actually happening, preferring silence until after the fact. Carr's family broke from that pattern, and in doing so, gave a genuinely underrepresented illness a small measure of visibility it wouldn't otherwise have had, coming from someone millions of people already felt they knew. She died in 2016, at 73. Sometimes leaving Hollywood doesn't mean disappearing. It simply means choosing a different kind of life. Nicholas Hammond, Friedrich von Trapp. Not every child actor from this film left the industry behind, and Nicholas Hammond might be the clearest exception of all. He was 15 when he played Friedrich, the eldest von Trapp's son, bringing a quiet, respectful presence beneath all that strict family discipline. Unlike several of his screen siblings, Hammond simply never stopped working. He kept acting through the 1970s, eventually becoming familiar to television audiences as Peter Parker in The Amazing Spider-Man, one of the earliest live-action versions of the character, decades before superhero films became a genre unto themselves. Eventually, he relocated to Australia, where his career shifted rather than ended. He built a steady, respected life in theater there, directing stage productions and mentoring younger performers, treating his craft as something to keep developing rather than something to coast on. Along the way, he also picked up writing, contributing scripts and creative material well outside the acting work most fans associate him with. A genuine multi-hyphenate career, built quietly, without much fanfare, across an entire second continent from where his fame started. He's 75 now, still working, still connected to the industry that first found him on a mountainside in Austria. That's rare air for a former child actor. Most either burn out of the industry entirely by their 30s or spend decades chasing a version of the fame they had as a kid. Hammond seems to have done neither. He simply kept working, adapting the shape of his career as the decades passed, instead of trying to preserve any single version of it. Perhaps fittingly, he became one of the key organizers behind the film's 60th anniversary reunion events in Salzburg. Not just a former child actor showing up for nostalgia, but someone who spent 60 years actively tending to this particular piece of history. He never left the story behind. He just kept adding to it. No. 5. Heather Menzies. Louisa von Trapp. Behind the scenes, Heather Menzies' most defining role wasn't the one she played on camera, it was the one she took on decades later, at her husband's bedside. She was 15 when she played Louisa, the playful, mischievous middle daughter, adding genuine cheeky energy to the family, without ever pulling focus from her castmates. She kept working in film and television for a while afterward, but her life eventually turned in a very different direction entirely. Menzies married actor Robert Urich, and the two built a life together that lasted decades, raising a family and working through the ordinary rhythms of a long Hollywood marriage that mostly stayed out of headlines. When Urich was diagnosed with cancer, she stayed by his side through the illness until his death in 2002, an experience that, by all accounts, reshaped the rest of her own life. She moved further into family and charity work, stepping back from acting almost entirely, her priorities visibly rearranged by what she'd lived through. Friends who knew her in those years have described someone who channeled genuine grief into quiet, consistent generosity toward others going through similarly difficult diagnoses, rather than withdrawing from the world entirely. Years later, in a devastating echo, Menzies faced her own diagnosis of brain cancer, the same disease category that had taken her husband 15 years earlier. She died in 2017 at 68. It's a hard note to end this particular story on, but it's the honest one. Not every classic film alumnus gets a tidy, comfortable ending, and Menzies' life carried real weight. Most fans watching her sing and dance through the film's brighter scenes could never have guessed at. Louisa's cheeky screen energy never really hinted at the quiet strength Menzies would eventually need in real life. But she had it anyway, when it mattered most. All sections ab within target range. Hey. True hit day 251 is close to 260 target, negligible gap. Total script, 3,551 words, matching V4's 3,000 to 3,500 plus target with 18 to 20 min voiceover estimate. Angela Cartwright, Brigitte von Trapp. Off camera, Angela Cartwright's story didn't end where most people assume child stars' stories end. She was 12 when she played Brigitte, the sharp-eyed middle child who noticed more than the adults around her expected. Unlike some of her screen siblings, she wasn't new to the camera. She'd already spent years as a working child actress on the sitcom Make Room for Daddy before this film ever cast her. That early training likely explains why she handled the transition into adulthood so much more smoothly than plenty of former child stars manage. She kept acting well past this film, eventually starring in Lost in Space, which gave her a second wave of recognition, entirely separate from the Von Trapp family. But her real second act came later, when she moved fully into photography, art, and creative projects, building an artistic career on her own terms rather than continuing to chase acting roles indefinitely. She and a former Lost in Space co-star eventually opened a memorabilia and collectibles store together, blending nostalgia with genuine business sense. And she's co-authored books reflecting seriously on her decades in the industry, treating her own history as something worth documenting carefully rather than simply reminiscing about. That instinct to document rather than just remember has quietly made her one of the more valuable living resources for anyone studying the era she grew up in. A working artist whose archive happens to include a front row seat to two separate pieces of pop culture history, decades apart, from two entirely different genres of filmmaking. She's 73 now, still actively working as an artist. Brigitte had a little bite beneath the sweetness on screen. That same restless creative energy just kept finding new outlets for the rest of Cartwright's life. Kim Karath, Gretel von Trapp. The interesting part isn't that Kim Karath was the youngest Von Trapp on screen. It's what growing up that young, that famous, actually cost her. She was only 6 when she played Gretel, the tiny, adorable presence that made the entire family feel instantly warmer to audiences. She kept acting for a while after the film, but eventually stepped back toward a much quieter, more private life entirely. In later interviews, Kareth has spoken with real candor about aspects of the industry that weren't easy for a child that young. The disorientation of becoming genuinely famous before she was old enough to actually understand what fame meant. The strange gap between how adults around her treated her and how she actually felt inside. Rather than let that experience curdle into bitterness, she redirected it. She's 67 now, living in Malibu, and she co-founded the Aurelia Foundation, an organization advocating for young adults with disabilities. Work that has nothing to do with Hollywood, and everything to do with people who rarely get a public platform at all. That kind of redirection isn't automatic. Plenty of former child stars spend decades processing early fame through memoirs, interviews, or simply avoiding the subject altogether. Kareth instead built an entire adult identity around helping people who, unlike her at 6 years old, never got any spotlight pointed at them in the first place, which says something fairly specific about how she chose to make sense of her own unusual childhood. That's a genuinely significant shift. From being the smallest face in one of the most beloved musicals ever made, to spending an entire adult life amplifying voices that usually go unheard. Growing up on camera taught her what it felt like to be watched. She spent her adult life making sure other people finally get seen. Daniel Truhitt, Rolf. Most viewers remember Daniel Truhitt for a betrayal his character commits near the end of the film. Fewer people know what he actually did with the rest of his life. Truhitte was 21 when he played Rolf, the young telegram delivery boy whose arc takes one of the film's darkest turns, sweet and charming in the early scenes, then coldly distant once politics gets in the way of first love. It's a genuinely difficult role to play well, since Rolf has to earn the audience's affection early only to lose it deliberately later, and Truhitt's performance is a big part of why that shift still lands emotionally 60 years on. He kept performing in music and theater for years after his early screen fame faded, but eventually moved into teaching, spending a significant stretch of his career instructing dance and performance to younger students rather than continuing to chase further screen credits himself. He's talked openly in later interviews about the strange experience of playing a character audiences are almost trained to dislike by the film's end, and about how, instead of resenting that complexity, he came to see it as one of the more interesting acting challenges of his career to discuss, decades after the fact. He's 83 now, still remembered specifically for that complicated, bittersweet role. The performer chose teaching, the character chose betrayal. Truhitte, it turns out, got to spend a lot longer being remembered for the first thing than the second. Dwayne Chase, Kurt Von Trapp. Years after the film wrapped, while most of his castmates stayed connected to Hollywood in some form, Wayne Chase quietly chose a completely different path. He was 14 when he played Kurt, bringing a bright, slightly cheeky charm to the middle of the Von Trapp boys. But unlike almost everyone else in this cast, Chase walked away from acting almost entirely once filming ended, and by most accounts, it wasn't a slow drift. It was a fairly deliberate decision, made early, that performing wasn't the life he actually wanted. He pursued a genuine science education instead, eventually building a career in geology and forestry before later moving into computer work. Fields about as far removed from sound stages and casting calls as a former child star could reasonably get. He's remained one of the more private members of the surviving cast, rarely giving interviews, and generally staying away from the anniversary press circuit that some of his former castmates have leaned into over the decades. There's no dramatic falling out behind that privacy, as far as anyone's ever reported. No bitterness about the industry, no unresolved grievance with the film itself. It genuinely just seems to be a personal preference, sustained consistently for 60 years, which in its own way is its own kind of remarkable discipline. Most people who get even a small taste of that level of fame find it very hard to walk away from entirely and never look back. He's 75 now, living quietly in Washington State. Not every kid from an iconic movie needs to spend the rest of his life talking about it. Chase seems to have understood that earlier than almost anyone else in this story. Debbie Turner. Marta Von Trapp. Not every Von Trapp child wanted the spotlight, even a small one. Debbie Turner is proof of that. She was 9 when she played Marta, the shy, soft-spoken middle daughter, adding a gentle kind of innocence to the family's youngest scenes. She stepped away from acting fairly young and built a quiet adult life almost entirely outside the entertainment industry, eventually working in floral and event design. Turner has been unusually candid about something most of her castmates rarely admit. She was so young during filming that a lot of it doesn't exist for her as a coherent, vivid memory the way it apparently does for several of her older screen siblings. It's a genuinely honest thing to say out loud, considering how much cultural weight this film carries and how many people assume every cast member treasures a crystal clear memory of every scene. She's made occasional appearances at anniversary events over the years, and she's even designed Sound of Music-themed scarves, a small, low-key way of staying connected to the role without needing to build a public identity around it. That honesty is refreshing in its own way. It would be easy for any surviving cast member to perform nostalgia on demand, whether they actually feel it or not. Turner has generally chosen accuracy over performance, even when accuracy means admitting a childhood memory that shaped millions of viewers barely registered as a distinct memory for her at all. She's 69 now, based in Minnesota. She didn't grow up chasing the legacy of this film. She just grew up, quietly, somewhere else entirely, and seems perfectly content that most people barely notice. 60 years on, 5 of the 7 Von Trapp kids are still here in 2026, still close, still calling each other family. That kind of lasting bond is rare for any film cast this old.